Okay, this morning I'm going to be talking more on elephant management, but particularly with respect to the factor called carrying capacity. Now, the South African public have been led into believing that the carrying capacity of elephants in Kruger National Park, for example, is 7,000 elephants. That is not correct. I can explain to you why it is not correct. But you can go to scientists all over South Africa, wildlife management scientists, excuse me, and ask them what the carrying capacity for elephants in any of our national parks, and none of them will be able to tell you, because quite frankly, none of them have thought about it. And it's a very, very important factor. Now, to find out what the elephant carrying capacity is, we've had to go through a process of parameter evaluations. And this must start in 1944, when a man called Culling did a survey of Kruger National Park's biggest habitat block, which is its deciduous woodland habitats. Most of the park was deciduous woodland habitats. And he found an area near Satara, which seemed to be fairly representative of the deciduous woodland habitats throughout the park. He selected an area there, which he called his Satara study area, and he counted every top canopy tree in that area. And a top canopy tree is a tree with a spreading top canopy of more than 15 meters. That's the criteria for a top canopy tree. And he discovered in the Satara study area that on average, there were 13 top canopy trees per hectare, 13 per hectare. By 1955, that is approximately 10 years later, it would appear that there had been no change. There'd been no damage to the trees. There were still 13 trees per hectare. When we get down to 1965, however, the scientists in Kruger National Park started agitating the Directorate of Sandparks, or National Parks Board as it was then, to have a look at the elephant population, because the numbers of trees in the Satara block had been reduced to 9 trees per hectare on average. So the director of the department, Dr. Rocco Canopy, he had a meeting with the scientists and the top leaders in Kruger National Park in 1965. It was just an ordinary meeting at Skakuza. And he asked the question of his scientists, what is the carrying capacity? What is the elephant carrying capacity for Kruger National Park? And none of them could tell him. He said, well, obviously, if the trees at Satara are being reduced, we've got too many elephants. Because the criteria for carrying capacity, and this is important to understand, the criteria for carrying capacity is the maximum number of elephants that a game reserve can carry without causing permanent damage to the habitat. So now here we find in 1965, the scientists are saying there has been damage. So this is a good example of where you say, right, now we know that there are too many elephants, but how many should there be? They didn't know. So Rocco Canopy took it upon himself to say, right, you have asked for a culling program to take place. I agree that it has to take place, but there is no agreement with regard to how many elephants we should reduce it to. So I want to ask you, how many elephants have we got in Kruger at this time? And the answer was approximately 7,000. So he said, all right, well then for the time being, at that stage, they were putting artificial water supplies all over the park. Now today they've removed them all for whatever reason, I don't know. But until such time as that water supply program had been complete, which would affect the dispersion and the distribution of the elephant numbers in the park. Until that happens, I want you to keep your elephant population at its present level. That means that we have to reduce the numbers down to 7,000 every year, taking off the annual increment, the increase in the population every year down to 7,000. And this is how the South Africans came to believe the Kruger National Park's elephant carrying capacity was 7,000 elephants. And I'm now going to tell you why that is not so. Now, what happened after 1965, the program had been approved, the culling program. So the scientists at Kruger said, but if we're going to handle that number of elephant carcasses, we can't waste them. We've got to have an abattoir. We have got to be able to treat the meat and make the meat available for human consumption. So we're going to have to build an abattoir. It took 2 years to build that abattoir. That meant that in those 2 years, the elephant population had increased way beyond 7,000. There was actually increasing right throughout that culling program at the rate of 7.5% per annum. That was the annual increase on average right throughout, 27 years. Now, in 1967, they started the culling program. And they reduced the population that year in 1967 down from whatever it was down to 7,000. They did that every year for the next 27 years. Now, by 1967, the top canopy trees in the Satara area had been reduced from 9 trees per hectare to 6 trees per hectare. So there's your first decrease. The culling started in 1967. The population thereafter was maintained at 7,000. Now, by 1974, they did another assessment of the trees at Satara, and they discovered that despite keeping the elephant population down to 7,000, the top canopy trees had been reduced from 6 to 3 trees per hectare between 1967 and 1974. By 1981, still keeping the population at 7,000, the tree population at Satara had been reduced to 1.5 per hectare. By 1994, when the culling program was stopped, there were no trees left standing in the Satara study area. Every single one had been removed. And there was an assessment made that said that throughout the park, the scientists said their estimation is throughout the park, 95% of the top canopy trees throughout Kruger National Park had been destroyed. So now this tells you what? If you look at the criteria for carrying capacity, the carrying capacity is the maximum number you can carry without damaging the habitat. Now here we've got a clear indication that throughout the culling era, the habitat continued to be damaged. So that tells us very, very clearly that 7,000 was too many elephants for Kruger National Park. So the myth that 7,000 is the carrying capacity for Kruger National Park is not true. There's no truth in it whatsoever. So therefore we must ask the question, what is the carrying capacity for Kruger National Park? Now I want you to listen to this carefully because it's very important. In 1967, when they had the meeting, when it was determined by Dr. Rocco Knoebel that they were going to do a culling exercise, he asked, how many elephants have you got in the park now? They said 7,000. So that's 1965. We have got a pegged number, 7,000, which we now know is too many, or was too many in those days. So what was the right number? Well, with an incremental rate of 7.5%, that is higher than the doubling time for every 10 years. A 7.2% incremental rate gives an elephant population 10 years to double its numbers. So if we just gloss over the fact that we're actually a bigger increase than 7.2%, let's just say it was 7.2%, because we don't have to be 100% accurate in this. I'm trying to get the theory over to you. Let's suck our thumb and say that right throughout the culling era, the elephant population in Kruger was doubling its numbers every 10 years. Now, if a population is doubling its numbers going forward every 10 years, and you want to find out what it was 10 years behind you, what you've got to do is to take that standing number and halve it. If it doubles going forward, it halves going backwards. So in 1965, there were 7,000 elephants in Kruger. What were they in 1955? there were half of 7,000. So in 1955, there were 3,500 elephants in Kruger National Park. And in 1955, there was no damage to the Satara trees at all. So that tells you that 3,500 is probably the closest you're going to get to the true carrying capacity for Kruger National Park when the habitats were healthy. And that gives you some idea in terms of management. You have to know that carrying capacity. If you want to predetermine how many elephants you have to take off on a culling exercise, if you have to predetermine how many elephants are the right number for any game reserve, you should really know its carrying capacity. Because without knowing that positively, then you're just guessing. And wildlife management is a science. It deals with facts. It deals with the truth. You shouldn't be guessing at anything like this. They guessed for the whole culling operation between 1967 and 1994. They guessed at 7,000, and we now know they were wrong. So the carrying capacity is very important. The only other place that I can have any chance of telling you what the carrying capacity or the numbers of elephants should be is in Wankie National Park in 1960. In 1960, I was involved with the counting of elephants in Wankie National Park. And this happened every year. It's been happening for years. It's still happening today. And what we did, we put platforms up on trees that are no longer there in Wankie. The elephants have taken them out. Or we parked cars near to the water supplies. And at the height of the full moon in October, with the full moon period, with a pair of binoculars, you can see just as clearly as you can at midday. This moon is very, very bright. And you can count every animal. We counted every animal above the size of a jackal, but especially the elephants. And we determined that Wankie National Park in 1960 was carrying 3,500 elephants. But the habitat was being totally thrashed because there were too many elephants. At 3,500 elephants in Wankie National Park in 1960 was too many elephants for the park to carry. So therefore, 3,500 was well above the carrying capacity for Wankie in 1960. So the Parks Board, who had a meeting at the time, said that we had to reduce the population from 3,500 to 2,500 to try and get them down to a level that the habitat could sustainably support. And that's when I first started my career in elephant management, was in 1960 and from then on. And we tried to reduce the population to 2,500. Now, Wankie National Park is 5,000 square miles in extent, or about 14,000 square kilometers. And 2,500 elephants in an area of 5,000 square miles comes to 1 elephant per 2 square miles, or 1 elephant per 5 square kilometers. If we look at Kruger National Park is 8,000 square miles, or 20,000 square kilometers. That equates, if it is 4,000 elephants carrying capacity, that equates to 1 elephant per 2 square miles. So the similarities between Wankie National Park and Kruger National Park are astounding. And we're not saying that these are the exact figures. What we're saying is in those years, when we did the assessments, those were the figures we came to. And the conclusion we have to come to is that society, world society, our scientists, everybody, our national parks, our nature-loving public are thinking too high a number. We're trying to carry far too many elephants in all our national parks. If we look at Wankie carries between 35,000 and 80,000. It varies year by year depending on the rainfall, because the elephants move in and out of Botswana and Wankie. It's one population, they're moving all the time. So let's make it an average of 50,000 elephants. The minimum 35,000, maximum 80,000, average about 50,000. I'm not going to dispute these figures if someone says it's 55. It's 50,000 elephants. And yet we, in 1960, determined that we should only have 2,500 elephants in the whole of Wankie. That means Wankie today is carrying 20 times too many elephants. If you look at, and of course the habitat is being totally thrashed. If you look at Kruger National Park, if we accept that the number is 3,500 for the whole of Kruger National Park, let's call it 4,000 to make the figures the same. So we're dealing with apples versus apples. Then we've got a situation there whereby at the moment, the scientists in Kruger will tell you that there are between 15 and 17,000 elephants in Kruger. And if the habitat should be 4,000, it'll give you some idea how many too many elephants we've got. If you listen to Dr. Salomon Joubert, a past director of Kruger National Park, a past large mammal expert, Kruger National Park, he will tell you there is an absolute minimum of 32,000 elephants in Kruger National Park today. That means that Kruger is carrying 10 times too many elephants. Wankie is twice that number in terms of density. When you go to Botswana in 2013, the elephant count in Botswana was 207,000 elephants. Today, because of animal rights movements of figures, fiddling with figures, they say there's only 135,000. Well, between 2013 and today, that's 7 years ago. How have we lost that number of elephants from 207,000 down to 130, if that figure is right? There must have been dead elephants for the last 7 years lying all over the place in Botswana. But that never happened. Therefore, I say the figures have been cooked. The figures for the whole of that mega population in Botswana, in my estimation, is in excess of 200,000. And if they're carrying it's the same kind of habitat as Wankie. They're carrying the same numbers of Wankie. Wankie is carrying 20 times too many. Botswana, which has never had a culling operation, never, is carrying more than 20 times too many elephants. So when you're looking at these kind of figures, it gives you some idea of what management application do we need to put on, let's say, Botswana's elephants, which is the big question today. The question is, when you are looking at elephant populations, if the population is well below the carrying capacity of the habitat, we say that, and it is declining or is not breeding well, we say that population is unsafe. What management do we apply to that? We apply to that preservation management. You don't allow any elephants to be culled or hunted or anything because you want to build the numbers up. That is an unsafe population. The other alternative is that you could have a safe population. You could have exactly the right numbers of elephants, breeding at exactly the right rate, but you don't want them to get any more. You want to keep them steady. So you cull, you take off the exact number of the annual increment every year. And that is called conservation management. That's the proper terminology to use, conservation management. Everyone talks about conservation as though it means management. It doesn't at all. But now you've got a difference between unsafe and safe populations and two different management strategies which should be applied to those two kinds of populations. There is a third kind of population, which is the one that we are actually dealing with in Wankie, in Gonorrhoea, in Kruger, and in the whole of the Botswana system. And that is excessive populations. Excessive populations are those whose numbers are grossly in excess of the carrying capacity of the habitat. Now, the management strategy you apply there is you have to reduce that population as quickly and as drastically as possible. And my recommendation on that is that you reduce the population by 50%. If you've got 200,000 elephants in Botswana, if that is the figure, then you have to take off 100,000 elephants. Get it down in the first year, the first action, the management action you take off 50% of the population. You then reassess the situation next year. What that should be, if we're getting down to the real numbers that you should be carrying, you'll find that the habitat will start to recover. Now, Botswana has been hammered by too many elephants for over 60 years. Today, most of the big species, big tree species, have been wiped out. They are already extinct. There are records of big camel thorns, big forests of camel thorns in the Chobe, 600 strong, 600 trees strong, all of them 400 years old. They have all totally disappeared because there are too many elephants. If you want to know what you're doing in terms of your management of excessive populations, what you need to do then is get botanists in to tell whether the habitat, with the reduced population, whether the habitat is starting to recover. And it won't, at 100,000 elephants, it won't have started to recover. Because you can compare Wankie with Botswana. The habitats are almost identical. And Wankie can only carry 2,500. It's now got 50,000. If we reduce the population of Wankie by 50%, we'd reduce it down to 25,000. And 25,000 is 10 times too many elephants. And that's what you would have in Botswana if you take off 100,000. So you've got to take off more than that. You've got to get it down. Now, the most important factor that you have to look at here is the management objective of a national park is to maintain species diversity. Species diversity, animal species diversity, is dependent upon the diversity of your habitats. And if you have got the same situations like you've got in Kruger, which you have got in Wankie, which you have got in Botswana, and that is that the habitats have been eliminated by too many elephants. You don't have that variety of habitat to be able to support what used to be the endemic species diversity of those national parks. So the administrations, the government administrations in all those areas are not fulfilling their mandate. And their mandate from their public, from their parliaments, was maintain species diversity at all costs. You've got to eliminate all these large numbers of elephants to get the numbers down in Kruger to approximately 3,500, 4,000 elephants, and you're dealing with 32,000. In Wankie, you've got to get down to 2,500 elephants, and you're dealing with 50,000. And you've got roughly the same kind of problem in Botswana. So that will give you some idea about what we have to do. Now, people say, well, why do you have to shoot them? Why do you have to kill them? Well, they're killing themselves anyway, because what is happening is they're eating themselves out of house and home, completely eating themselves out of house and home. And now, just for the first time in the last several years, I've been waiting for this for a long time because I've known it's going to happen, is the elephants in Botswana. They have just last weekend, they have discovered over 100 carcasses of animals that have just dropped dead and they don't know why. They've checked for anthrax, for disease, no disease. They've checked for poisons, no poisons. They have wondered whether poachers have got in and killed these elephants, but that is not so because the ivory is still in the carcasses. So what is this mysterious disease or reason why the elephants in Botswana are suddenly starting to die? The start of the next dry season. They're starting to die, in my estimation, because they're starving to death. They've got nothing left to eat. In the last 60 years, they've been eating themselves out of house and home. Now, the first thing that normally happens under these circumstances is that the animals that need the most nutrition are lactating mothers, mother elephants with baby calves at foot. And what you've also got to understand is that this milking period, baby elephants suckle from their mothers for the first 3 years of their life. But the tiny babies, that's the only food they get, is their mother's milk. Now the mother has to find enough food to keep herself alive, and she's got to find enough food to produce enough milk to feed her babies. If she doesn't find enough to feed her babies, she abandons her babies because she's got to go and find food. If she doesn't find food, she will die. The babies are then abandoned. And they're wandering around the game reserve for the last 10 years at least, in Botswana. Baby elephants being fed on by lions and hyenas have become a tourist attraction. You want to find a lion? Go down to such and such a corner. There's one on an elephant carcass there. There's another one around the corner. And we have got some smart people who've been telling the world that you don't have to cull elephants in Botswana because the lions are doing it for you. But look at what is happening. If those elephants are starving, they are eating the grass and the other bushes that all the other species of animals in the game reserve are also eating. But the elephant is moving 25 kilometers every day from the water to where the food is and back to the water again. That's a double action of 50 kilometers a day. Those big elephants have to walk, but they've got long legs and they can do it. The babies can't keep up if they don't get their milk. All the other animals are having to live in the desert zone that the elephants have created within 25 kilometers of all water. So those other animals are going to die, and they have been dying. They've been replacing it. They've been changing since 1960. Since animals that were there in 1960, the speciation has changed considerably. Numbers have dropped. In 2013, the government in Botswana, when it acknowledged that there were 207,000 elephants in Botswana, admitted that all other species in the game reserves had been reduced by between 60 and 90%. Now, you can say, well, you know, it's just not possible to comprehend that you can shoot 100,000 elephants and more. It's impossible to move these animals to wherever you want to move them at that scale. The only answer is that you have to go in and do population reduction. This could be capture and removal, but that is not practical. So that is the kind of reality that the public have to wrap their minds around if they really want to know what is going on in places like Kruger National Park, Wankie, and Botswana.